everybody. Welcome back to the Cinema Club podcast. We're so excited to have you on this episode. A little bit about the podcast for those, if this is your first time listening. Every week, I invite one member of the Cinema Club to be my host for the week, who will choose the movie of the week and then join me on the podcast to talk about the film. This week, we have a very big movie. It's considered to be one of the greatest films of all time, and that is Orson Welles' masterpiece, Citizen Kane.
Lights! Give me a mic. Thank you. How do you do, ladies and gentlemen? This is Orson Welles. I'm speaking for the Mercury Theater, and what follows is supposed to advertise our first motion picture. Citizen Kane is the title, and we hope it can correctly be called a coming attraction. It's certainly coming to this theater, and I think our Mercury actors make it an attraction. I'd like you to meet them. Speaking of attractions, well, the chorus girls are certainly an attraction, but frankly, ladies and gentlemen, we're just showing you the chorus girls for purposes of ballyhoo. It's a pretty nice ballyhoo. But here's some of our real Mercury people. This is the first time you've seen most of them on the screen. Hey, give Joe a little light. Thanks. Now smile for the folks, Joe. Smile. Joseph Cotton, ladies and gentlemen. That's it. Joseph Cotton. I think you're going to see a lot of him. Here's Ruth Warwick, whom I know you love. Ruth. Look at the camera, Ruth. We caught Ruth with her hair up. And here's somebody you've all heard on the radio, so I don't have to tell you he's wonderful, Ray Collins. Dorothy Commengore is a name I'm going to repeat. Dorothy Commengore. I won't have to repeat it much longer. You'll be repeating it. And here's George Coulouris, who's a grand actor. I'll say that name again. George Coulouris. Watch it. Here comes Everett Sloane. Look out, Everett. Oops. Everett Sloane, ladies and gentlemen, he isn't necessarily a comedian. And here's one of the best actors in the world, Agnes Moorehead. I've said a lot of nice things, but Erskine Sanford deserves some more. Erskine Sanford. So does Paul. Paul Stewart, everybody. Citizen Kane is a modern American story about a man called Kane, Charles Foster Kane. I don't know how to tell you about him. There's so many things to say. I'll turn you over instead to the characters in the picture. As you'll see, they feel very strongly on the subject.
Charles Foster Kane is...
Sure, he started the war. But do you think if it hadn't been for Mr. Kane, the United States would have the Panama Canal?
Charles Foster Kane is nothing more or less than a communist.
Kane, governor. Listen, when the voters of this state and Mrs. Kane learn what I found out about Mr. Kane and a certain little blondie named Susan Alexander, he couldn't be elected dog catcher. I'm going to skin Mr. Charles Foster Kane alive.
I'm going to marry him next week at the White House.
Emily, I hear you've been stepping out with Charlie Kane.
Of course I love him. I gave him $60 million.
Well, of course I love him. He's the richest man in America.
But all the girls say about him at first.
But you know, I can't help but admire him.
He's crazy.
He's wonderful.
Ladies and gentlemen, I don't know what you'll think about Mr. Kane. I can't imagine. You see, I play the part myself. Well, Kane is a hero and a scoundrel, a no-account and a swell guy, a great lover, a great American citizen, and a dirty dog. It depends on who's talking about him. What's the real truth about Charles Foster Kane? I wish you'd come to this theater when Citizen Kane plays here and decide for yourself.
I consider it to be one of the greatest films of all time as well. It's on my list of greatest films ever made. May not be my favorite film of all time, but it is one of the greatest films, I believe. It has 100% on Rotten Tomatoes, written, directed, and starring Orson Welles. It is such a masterpiece of a film. And I want to thank Timothy Messina, who's my co-host this week, for choosing this movie. Thank you, and welcome to the podcast, Tim.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, and you're most welcome. I'm glad to be here.
Tim, what is it that you do?
So for a living, I am the director of contemporary music at a local Methodist church here in Greenville, North Carolina. And with that, I sing and play bass guitar and lead contemporary worship. But I'm also a huge cinephile, and I also act and I do theater. I do a lot of stuff with the local arts.
Awesome. Well, it's so great to have you on. I know Tim. He has worked on a couple, I think just one of the films that I've worked on.
I think so.
It was an awesome little short we did. So it's great to have you on. And our guest for this week is another actor friend of mine. Recently worked with him, but so glad he's on this episode. And that's Evan Marr. Evan, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here. I love movies, man.
Well, so glad to have you on the episode, Evan. And let's get into this. And just to be completely clear, before we get any further and get into the movie, I just want to give a huge spoiler warning because we are going to be talking about anything and everything about the film. Before we get into the synopsis and into our discussion into the movie, I just want to ask you, Tim, real quick, why did you choose this movie? Of any film you could choose, why was it this movie that you wanted to share with us and to share to our club?
Well, besides it being one of the greatest movies of all time, and I wanted to talk about it for a while. I watched it recently as a precursor to watching David Fincher's new film, Mank, which is about Herman Mankiewicz's writing of the initial draft of Citizen Kane and his inspiration for all of it. And so I thought of that, and it's been kind of fresh on my mind, so I figured I'd bring this one up.
Well, thank you so much, because I love this movie, like I have said, and I'm so excited to get us talking about this movie. So with that, again, like I said, it's 100% on Rotten Tomatoes. This is such an amazing film. Critics and fans alike review it with such high esteem. The running time is 1 hour and 59 minutes, so it's not one of the longest films out there, kind of an average film in length, but there is so much packed in it. I mean, it's inspired by the life of William Randall Hearst. It's loosely inspired, and Orson Welles was trying to do a lot in this film to really kind of showcase the American dream and how corruptible the embodiment of capitalism can be in America and really in the world. It starts in 1941, and newspaper tycoon Charles Foster Kane is dead. The opening shots show Xanadu Kane's vast, elaborate, and now unkept estate in Florida. Interspersed with segments of his newsreel obituary are scenes from his life and death. Most puzzling are his last moments clutching a snow globe. He mutters the word Rosebud. Kane, whose life was news and whose newspapers not only reported but formed public opinion, was central to his time, a larger-than-life figure. The newsreel editor assigns a reporter called Thompson to investigate Rosebud. So what I thought about this opening sequence was that it really played almost like we see in an opera, like the prelude to an opera or a musical. In a prelude to an opera or musical, you have all these little themes of music usually that come through, and you kind of hear those themes throughout the film. But what Orson Welles did in this first newsreel bit that we see is he gives us the entire life story of Charles Foster Kane in just a few minutes. So we know already what's going to happen. But what the rest of the movie does is then gives context to what has happened.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing that I really appreciated with this film is that, especially with this open scene and with the rest of this film, but with the opening scene here, it's just one perspective on him. And the whole rest of the film is the perspectives of just the several people that have been closest to him throughout his life.
Not only is it a perspective, but it is an unbiased perspective. Orson Welles isn't trying to give you an opinion. He's not trying to say, this is who Charles Foster Kane is. This is what I want you to think of him, as a good guy or bad guy. It's up to you to make the opinion that you want to make of who Charles Foster Kane is.
Absolutely. And it's you don't see Kane's full perspective as himself. You only get to see that through the lens of other people. And it's a fascinating way of telling this story. I'm very curious to see how he would have seen himself.
I thought it was interesting because, like, I thought it was just, just the film being narrated, just like as a film is being narrated, just a random narrator, random this. And then it leads into, what was it, the newspaper guys or whoever was making that article where who were trying to figure out what Rosebud meant, had like it was like a whole projector thing. And I was like, oh, okay, so this is playing into the story. And I was like very interested because I thought it was just like really like that old style of film where it's just like, here is this man and this is what's happening. And I was like, oh, interesting. But no, it wasn't that at all. And I thought that was wonderful.
And not only is it just like a narration of this guy, but it's these newscasters saying that his whole life, and especially the Xanadu house and mansion that he created for himself, it was a monument to himself. He was America's Kubla Khan. He was a monopoly man who owned basically everything. Not only did he own a bunch of newspapers or radio stations, but he owned buildings. He owned convenience stores. He owned all these different things. He wasn't just a monopoly man of one thing. He kind of embodied that American dream. He embodied capitalism. And he was really like throughout the story, and especially right in this first bit, he was almost more powerful than even the US leaders or world leaders themselves. He had all the power. He even married the president's niece. I mean, this guy had everything, and that just makes what happens to him in the end so much more of a dramatic rise and a dramatic fall to nothingness.
Yeah, he gains everything from where we learn, what's the guy's name? The guy that his mother sold him and the gold mine to the banker. Yeah, Thatcher, thank you, yes. So from there on, he gains so much material wealth, and that's where he learns what love is through material things, and he gains so much through that.
And at the beginning, didn't he refused because he had so much more that he was going to be given by the bank, but he refused it and just took the tiny little newspaper, And I was like, how does this guy turn into this tycoon? He's got a tiny little newspaper, like Nick said. I mean, he really embodied the American dream.
It was said later in the film, and I just want to touch on this a little bit now because I want to get into it later on. But he starts as an everyman, basically. He starts from nothing. He starts in basically squalor, and then he's given a lot, but he's still the people's man. He still cares about the people, and he just wants to get the love of the people of his state, of his country, of the world. And what we find out later on is that changes. He goes from being somebody of the people to being somebody who takes from the people. So moving on, Thompson digs into Kane's life and hears a lot of stories, but none of them reveal the meaning of Rosebud. The reporter sees Susan Alexander Kane, the tycoon's ex-wife. Then he reads an unpublished memoir of Mr. Thatcher, Kane's early financial advisor and childhood guardian, after his mother signed guardianship of the boy and his fortune over to Thatcher despite his father's objections. So what we see in the next part, and I think what Orson Welles did here to show this next part, the bit of storytelling that he did, was very genius, because he used the Thompson character going to Thatcher's place of business after he died and reading his journal, and everything that we see then is through the perspective of Thatcher. It isn't through like the perspective of we as like the godlike figure going through the story. We see them through the perspective of Thatcher. Thatcher goes to the place where Kane grew up. He goes to that place and he brings him out, and then we see what happens of his life with Thatcher. But what Orson Welles did in this scene that was revolutionary is he really used the camera as a character here. We as the audience through the camera are taken through this and are told the story. And the way he does that is he uses deep focus to show a lot of different layers of the film. You can see the focus of the person right in the foreground to the person way in the background. Everybody's in focus. So what he's saying is that all of these different people in the scene, all these different things in the scene are very important.
Absolutely. And with that scene in particular, the deep focus that he uses, you see everything that's happening on the inside. You see the conversation that's happening between Thatcher and Kane's parents. And then you also see in full, clear, deep focus, Kane outside playing in the snow. And it's your only glimpse that we as the viewer get to see him in true happiness.
But also not only in true happiness, but we also see him outside. He's outside of that conversation of the people that are basically making the decisions of what his life is going to be. And we see that through the rest of the film. There's a lot of these different things, such as the depression happening or other things that are out of his control that basically inform what happens to the rest of his life. He may seemingly have all the control, but he really doesn't. He has no control over the way his life goes. And I think that really shows how privilege can be such a detriment to a lot of people. I mean, we see this in a lot of people of power. We see them coming from very privileged backgrounds, but who they actually become is very disassociated from the rest of the people around them. They're not a part of the world. They don't really understand the majority and the average Joe. They don't understand that way of life. And so it separates them from everybody else. And Kane is separated from not only his parents, but the rest of his life and the people around him.
I thought that was so interesting because, like you said, Nick, every character was at a different depth. And so the mom was at the front and she had the most power in the scene because she pretty much decides what she's going to do with her son. Then you've got Thatcher, who's pretty much, it's decided he's taking the son. The dad behind him, and he's arguing, no, you can't just take my son like this. And then in the very back, there's Kane outside playing in the snow for the Union, whatever he says. And he has no power over anything. And I thought that was so interesting because you see that used in films all the time. Like it was a master class this was my first time watching. And I was like, I'm going to come into this with a fresh perspective. I don't know anything about this movie. I didn't really even know what it was about. The only thing I knew about it was this, he mutters the word rosebud. And so I went into it with that fresh perspective and I was just picking apart these little things that I see in films to this day. Like that's how groundbreaking this film was and how influential it was. I mean, it was wonderful.
Yeah, so the whole play on the mise en scene that's there, or mise en scène, if you want to go with the French. Yeah, the exact positioning of where everybody is on top of Greg Toland's cinematography on that. It's exactly that power play that you're talking about, and I agree wholeheartedly.
So years later, as he is about to get control of his business affairs, Kane's interest in the newspaper is piqued when he noticed that he owned the struggling New York Daily Inquirer. Kane's paper starts by attacking Thatcher's traction interest as corrupt, and they suffer as a result. Thatcher confronts Kane at the Inquirer to talk to him about attacking businesses that Kane himself owns considerable stock in, as well as throwing so much money away on low-class journalism, such as investigating the Spanish-American War. However, Kane defiantly tells Thatcher that he wants to use journalism to protect the interests of ordinary people from the likes of Thatcher. The scene shifts to an office at a time considerably sooner than 60 years later, in which Kane's bankrupted media empire is placed back under the control of Thatcher. So going back to what Evan was talking about, him being like more of a normal man, starting from nothing and being more towards the people. I mean, here we really see that finally happen. We see him coming back from Europe as this really young and reckless type of person. Basically, he says to Thatcher, it doesn't matter what I do. I don't care because I have enough money that it would take 60 years to run this thing into the ground, this company in the ground. I don't care. I'm going to do what I want and I'm going to be there for the people. But then we see then that the depression then came along and he didn't account for that. And that's something that is such a part of us as humans, that young confidence, this inventive and creative, out of the box kind of mentality that so many of us young people have. And then that's something that's really needed. I mean, we see all the time in business, the businesses that actually are successful in this day and age, and why this film is so apropos to what's happening today. It's so relevant to us now as it was in 1941 when it came out, is that the young people are shaping the future of our country and the future of the world. And we see, especially through the coronavirus here, I mean, everybody's had to try to change how they do business. And it's the people that really are innovating, that are trying to think of outside the box ideas that are going to be successful. And this is the way that he was. But then we see also the danger of that, the danger of being young and confident and being out of the box and not looking at your future, not trying to create create something stable for your future, because that could be gone in a flash, like when the Depression happened, or when, I mean, for us, it's very timely with the coronavirus. A lot of us are out of work, lost jobs, and are trying to figure out what we're going to do next. And a lot of us, we haven't had enough time to really get ourselves a good foothold. But that's something that's really important to remember for the future.
Yeah, I agree. It's something that just kind of crossed my mind as you were saying that, was the fact that oftentimes you have this wealth, and you decide what to do with the money that you have, or do with whatever wealth that you have. Is oftentimes it ends up being for yourself. So say you have the wealth, you have suddenly the opportunity to advance just yourself, and you may have altruistic thoughts about that, but it just ends up being, how can I protect myself with this wealth? And thus, when it gets to bad times, such as a Great Depression, such as a 2008 housing crisis, as a 2020 coronavirus, as times that are people are desperate for economic help, that these people are blind to that, because they're not, going back to what we said earlier, they're often not a part of the world, and so they don't relate to everything that's happening. So it's a shame, but we do what we can, but it's often hard to relate. Again, it's that perspective bit that I mentioned earlier.
I like the way you put that, Tim, because for me, that was when I saw the older Kane come out, and looking back on it, I was like, that was the moment where he loses that young confidence. And he says, oh, okay, things can happen. This is the real world. I could lose all my money, and I did. And so you see it hit him on his face. And I think Orson Welles is also kind of underrated as an actor, because his character development in this movie was insanity. And he goes from being one person to a completely different person, all within 2 hours. Like Nick said, it's not a very long movie, and you see him go through complete shifts in character.
And what is so awesome about what you're just saying there about Orson Welles is he was 25 when he made this film, and he plays these characters that are young and really old, which also goes to show just at the amazingness of the production of this film. I mean, the makeup for that time and the prosthetic work for the time is just flawless. Like he goes from a guy that is in his young 20s all the way up to him being a very old man. And not only him, but Dorothy Comminger's character of Susan Alexander, as well as some of the others like Joseph Cotton's Jed Leland. I mean, Dorothy Comminger was 28 years old and Joseph Cotton was 36. So these people were in their 20s and 30s, yet the makeup is so good that they are able to look like they're really old people as well. Orson Welles was such a prodigy as a filmmaker and a director, because at 25, he was able to make one of the greatest, if not the greatest film of all time.
And for his first directorial debut.
I mean, he had directed some radio shows, and like War of the Worlds, it was before this, I believe, as well as some stage plays. But this was his first directorial debut in a Hollywood movie in the film world, really.
And you mentioned with the makeup and such, and it's not just the makeup. He had said that he had more makeup actually playing the younger version of Kane than the older. Oftentimes, but you have some prosthesis and other things to like bald caps, things like that. But it's with the power of like camera angles and such. And even Dorothy Comminger, you had mentioned her makeup as well, and Joseph Cotton. But Dorothy Comminger was also pregnant at the time of shooting. And so they had to play with the angles a lot with that to hide her growing nature.
Yeah, I thought when I was watching it, I was like, I understand why this movie is one of the best of all time, because to me, it's like it was Hollywood's calling card at the time. It was like, this is what a movie can be. Like, look at this makeup, look at these camera angles, look at what you can do here. you know?
I want to say, though, Evan, that actually Hollywood at this time, especially simply because of politics and everything, because this was basically a diss on William Randall Hearst. William Randall Hearst was one of the most powerful Americans of that time, and he had such power in Hollywood that there were times where he basically tried to blacklist Orson Welles. He called him a communist, which at the time basically blacklisted you from ever working in Hollywood. And because of that, Orson Welles had a really hard time making it in Hollywood. There were times where later in life he would call himself basically the prodigal son of the Hollywood world because they didn't accept him a lot of the time. And especially right after this movie came out, critics did not like this movie. It did not do well at the box office. Yeah, it made $1.6 million at the box office. This film was made on a very low budget of $680,000, where there were other films made for like $3.18 million that were making millions of dollars at the box office even at the time. And this really kind of panned at the box office, did not do well, especially with critics. And to me, this is really the turning point between classic Hollywood and modern films. But we see that today. They did not see that at that time, which is such a disappointing thing to me because Orson Welles is one of the best directors, one of the best filmmakers of all time, for sure. And this film is in that category as well.
And I follow the Oscars quite a bit, and the Oscars, as much as a game of politics as that is, it gives me a really amazing list of movies to watch generally. So I tend to go for that. But it was up for 9 Oscars. It only won 1, and that was for screenwriting. And the movie that it beat out for Best Picture was John Ford's How Green Was My Valley, which is, I mean, sure, it's an okay movie, but
no, it's not.
Yeah, hindsight being 2020 or 2021 now, but it doesn't hold a candle to Kane, and it's a shame that it couldn't be recognized like that back in 1941.
I mean, Orson Welles went to his grave, I mean, at an early age, but he went to his grave with so many of his films not being accepted, kind of being that reject of Hollywood, kind of not getting his due, and like so many great talents out there, composers of the classic period, they go to their graves. Beethoven's another one, went to his grave without having the recognition that they so well deserved. And Orson Welles is that of our time, for sure. So Leland goes on to describe Kane's second marriage to Susan Alexander. Kane started seeing her while he was still married to Emily during his campaign for governor. His opponent found out about Susan and threatened to tell the press unless Kane withdrew from the race. Kane refused. The story came out and he lost the election along with his first marriage, and he married Susan soon after his divorce from Emily was final. Now, I just wanted to make a quick note here because one of the biggest and grandest moments of the film is that rally that Kane has with the huge backdrop and huge poster of Kane's face at this rally for governor. And what's so interesting about this specific shot is that it revolutionized some visual techniques that was used during that time and really kind of laid the groundwork for modern even CGI, because that scene in particular was actually a matte painting. But when you actually look at like the foreground elements and kind of look at the people, those people are moving. Basically what they did was they kind of made little cuts around the heads of the characters and basically put that mat in front of a sheet and then swung basically a light behind there and kind of moved a light around the back to make it look like the characters were moving. That was a matte painting. Those weren't real people. They didn't have the budget to have hundreds and thousands of people in an arena. That kind of ingenuity like blew all the visual techniques out of the water. They were using every little technique from that to editing to transitions. Like, it's just amazing how groundbreaking this film was.
That's impressive. And top that off with that particular crane shot that leads to seeing the actual Kane with the poster Kane in the back, or actually from this side. It's such a cool shot, among others.
The other part of that shot was actually done in reverse at 150% speed.
Really? Wow.
I love hearing you guys talk about this because I'm finally understanding why filmmakers dig this movie so much. Like, every little thing that they did just makes filmmakers go crazy. They're like, yes.
That movie revolutionized so many techniques in filmmaking that people are using today. The reason, like, today that a lot of people, like you just said, you haven't seen this movie or didn't think a lot of it and maybe watched the movie and weren't like, this is an amazing film. It was an okay film, but it wasn't the greatest film of all time. The reason is because that film and those techniques have been copied by so many filmmakers that to us at this day, we've seen that. We've seen those things before. We've seen it in so many different films, but this was the first time a lot of this stuff happened. Going on from there, although her singing talent was modest, Kane was ambitious on his wife's behalf. He paid for voice lessons, built an opera house in Chicago, and financed an elaborate production for her debut. At the opening night's performance, which was very poorly received by the audience, to the point where Kane is quickly left alone applauding his wife's performance. Kane arrived at his office of the Chicago Inquirer to find Leland drunk again and passed out over his typewriter, his cheek resting on his unfinished and very negative review of Susan's performance. Kane finishes the review in the same negative vein and decides to run it on all of his papers, but he fires Leland. Susan wants to quit, but Kane insists that she keeps performing until a suicide attempt convinces him she needs to give up on singing. One idea that really came out of this last sequence that we just talked about is that Kane was in such support of his wife's career as a singer, not for herself, but of himself, that he did whatever it would take just to make her successful. He was basically trying to live through her, trying to will things. And that's basically a theme throughout this entire movie, is that Kane basically tries to will everything around him into what he wants to happen. And it's the same with his wife. I mean, he even tells this vocal teacher, it is not your job to give Mrs. Kane your opinion of her talents. It's your job to train her voice. One lesson that I've learned is that a lot of the times it is really detrimental to another person to try to force your will upon them, to try to encourage them. And in this case, like, he wasn't saying you have to do this. He was doing something very detrimental to her to basically tell her you can make a career out of something that you really don't have the talent in. And especially in something like opera or vocals, if you don't have the talent, you're not going to make it. I see so many people out there that are trying to make a career out of something they're not good at and failing. And so I think that especially here we see that Kane's insistence on her doing something that she's really not good at. And she even said when she first met him, oh, I don't have the greatest voice. He basically forced her to do something because he wanted her to be successful. He wanted everything in his life to be successful. And that just drove a wedge in their relationship later on.
Yeah, absolutely. And which is often why you saw the quotations around singer in those headlines, and it's a shame. At ECU, I was a voice performance major, so that whole segment resonates with me a lot. That's also one of those cases where we were kind of free in our studio classes, that whenever someone would present a song to sing for the studio, we were given the floor to give our critiques on what it was. Oftentimes is based on what the studio professor had been teaching us. And so, like, if we see something that we think they could work on, the floor was open for us to talk about. Now, that solicited criticism right there. You're expecting that, and it's important to, as you said, to be honest with the person about that. I made a mistake recently, not really being fully honest about someone's voice. And that caused a bit of a rift between us. And since mended, but we're working on things on that. But I personally have a difficult time with giving that type of criticism because if it's unsolicited, it's often met with hostility a little bit. it's a slight aside to what we're talking about, but it's like kind of my personal experience with that. But at the same time, she didn't want that. That's basically the same way. It's forcing his will upon hers, and that's a wedge right there, as you said.
Yeah, I completely agree with both of you guys. Like, I've found in my life and, throughout time, you see it, like, as soon as you put your will onto what someone else wants to do, that is the easiest way to ruin a relationship. I mean, talk about marriages, like, that is the biggest reason marriages fail, or one of them, because somebody wants the other one to do this. I just watched Don John the other day, and I'm not going to spoil it or anything, but in that movie, his girlfriend's pretty much forced him to do something he doesn't want to do. And guess what? It doesn't work out.
That's an underrated movie, actually.
It really is.
But we see this, especially in this movie. I think it's a very memeable moment. I've seen a lot of memes in this particular shot, but it kind of showcases exactly what we're talking about. I mean, it's when Kane is in the audience after her performance and he just starts clapping. He waits till basically halfway through, but when he doesn't hear the rest of the crowd are giving her a standing ovation, he basically just starts clapping, and he gives this very disheartened clap that just gets bigger and bigger and bigger and continues till after the rest of the people are clapping. He's trying to force the world to make her successful, force the world to see her as not who he sees her, but he does not want to admit that it was his failure to put her in this position. This also is that turning point in their relationship where he finally sees her as she is. He sees that she's never going to be who he wants her to be. And that's why when he goes back to the paper, he decides to continue the review, to finish that horrible review of her, and why later on they really are in Xanadu by themselves and there is no love there anymore.
Yeah, he mentions, it's a little bit later, he mentions that I will not be ridiculed. So if we haven't seen it before, that's validation that his efforts with her are entirely for him. And that's just shameful.
Yeah. And it's like you were saying before, Nick, like, this movie is so relevant today because he had been working on this newspaper where his will is whatever he wants to put on that newspaper. And so when he finds out, I can't do this with my wife, it hits him like a ton of bricks, And so it's just so relevant to what's going on now with media and stuff. It's crazy to see how he realizes, he's like, oh crap, I can't just will people to think my wife has the best voice in the world. It's just not going to happen.
There are so many other themes of this film that are so apropos to today that we see happening. History is doomed to repeat itself. I mean, you have corruption, you have power. You see so many of these figures of our government, of other corporations, of big businesses that are Citizen Kanes of today that make this film so relevant and give us a warning that people are corruptible, that people that start off with good intentions, like both of you said earlier, if they are in a place that is easily corruptible, or if they are in a place where something else means more to them than their own morality, those things are going to take control and change who they are and poison those good intentions.
Not to mention the two headlines that they prepared for when Kane actually lost the election.
So the couple then moved to Florida onto Kane's 49,000-acre private pleasure ground that is ostentatiously built for Susan. In a huge, echoing and nearly empty stone hall, Susan does jigsaw puzzles and longs to be in New York where things are happening, where she can be around her friends. But Kane decides that he just wants to stay there with her. He does not want to be around the public anymore that has basically ridiculed him to oblivion at this point. They do not want him in the public eye, and he just wants to stay in his isolation. But he does decide to leave Xanadu and arrange an event he calls a picnic involving an overnight stay in the Everglades. In their tent, Susan accuses him of trying to buy her love, despite never loving anyone but himself and never giving her anything that mattered. He slaps her, and shortly thereafter, she leaves him. So what I thought was so powerful in this sequence is just the fact that Kane, his greatest achievement, this Xanadu estate, this vast showcase of his wealth, of his power, that is supposed to be a monument to his success, is basically his greatest isolation. There is nobody else left in his life. Everybody has turned on him. Nobody accepts him anymore. He has no friends. His greatness strained the relationships he had until there was no love anymore for them to give. Because up to this point, his greatest yearning is to be loved, and he will do whatever it takes to be loved. And that is the central theme of this entire movie, is his desire to be loved by his friends, to be loved by his family, to be loved by the people, by the entire world, by his wife. He squeezes that until it's dry and there's nothing left, and he is left alone because he gives nothing back. His wife says, "You gave me nothing back." And yeah, maybe that comes from a childhood where he was taken from a home where he was never loved. His mother was a very callous and cold person. He was never loved as a child. His father was a drunk and very abusive. He didn't get that. And so, of course, he's going to desire love from the world, but it is his money and it is his privilege that makes him unlovable, that makes him a person that cannot give love back. He doesn't know how to love because his power has taken over that.
Yet again, with the film being so relevant today, where do people go to find love nowadays? Social media. Citizen Kane was the embodiment of social media. Like he just wanted love, and nowadays anybody can seek it. It's bad. There's tons of little Citizen Kanes running around, but hey, that's the world we live in.
One thing that just goes to show the lengths that Orson Welles went to as not only a director, but also an actor, is that during the scene in which his wife leaves him and he just tears the entire room apart, during that process of him actually tearing that room apart, he actually cut his hand open and started bleeding all over the set. But he just kept going. And it just added to the realism because you actually can see the realism of the pain in his eyes. He used what was happening to him as a physical actor to influence the decisions that he took as an actor, and just goes to show what an artist he was, and that he could just push through that and use that as a storytelling technique to further his performance.
Watched that the other day with my boyfriend. He had said, I wonder what it would be like if they had to reset everything that he destroyed in that scene. Fortunately, they only did it in one take with multiple camera angles. But I'm like, what if they did have to redo all of that? But yeah, the realism there. I also read that he had cut his hand during that, and I immediately thought of Leonardo DiCaprio in Django Unchained in the one scene there. And I'm like, that's dedication. Like, he should have gotten an Oscar nomination for that. That just baffled me there.
Yeah, and one thing that in the filmmaking industry, especially today, that I've noticed and heard is that if you have a stunt, and one really good example is Tom Cruise in Mission Impossible, if you're a stunt person and something goes horribly wrong or you get really hurt during a take, it's kind of like courtesy of the editors to actually put the take in which somebody got hurt into the actual final sequence. And so this is one of those cases where Orson Welles was like, you know what, we could redo this, but the first take is so good that we're just going to use it because it's perfect as is.
Yeah, that's always so interesting to me because as an actor, like, do I need to hurt myself on set for them to use my take? Is that what needs to happen? But no, it's just so interesting. Like, you hear all these stories of Leonardo DiCaprio, Orson Welles, Tom Cruise, Jake Gyllenhaal hurting themselves on set, and then the take is always used. And it's like, I don't want to have to do that, but I will. I will.
From the Kane's butler, Raymond, Thompson hears how Kane trashed Susan's room after she left, but stopped when he came across that snow globe. As Kane pocketed the snow globe, Raymond heard him say Rosebud. Raymond has no idea what it means. However, he tells Thompson that he was in the room to hear Kane say Rosebud again just before he dies. In Xanadu's big stone hall, the reporters are getting ready to leave. The place is jam-packed, full of packing crates full of art and household goods. Some valuable, some not. Thompson explains to the other reporters that he never found the meaning of Rosebud, but that it doesn't matter. The camera pans across the crates and finds the sled that Kane played with in his childhood. And in one of the final scenes, men toss the sled into an incinerator, and we see the word Rosebud written on the sled. So just as we said right at the beginning of this episode, right when we were starting to get into the synopsis, what Orson Welles does is he gives us this perspective where we're not told what we should think. We're given a very unbiased perspective here, and it's up to us to figure out what we want the movie to mean and how it to end. And so what this movie does is it has a very unconventional ending. It leaves the audience not very satisfied, and it doesn't answer the question that is said throughout the entire movie, and that is, who is Rosebud?
I actually kind of think, yes, Thompson is right in saying that you cannot summarize a man by a single word, but I feel that Rosebud actually kind of sums up what he lost. And especially from the very beginning, because when you see Kane getting turned over to Thatcher, the first scene that happens right after that is Christmas. And what's the gift that he gets? A completely new sled. It doesn't say Rosebud on it, so that's the death of Rosebud right there.
The other part is the first sled that we see is a very kind of rudimentary sled. It's not very nice, but the sled that he gets once he's in a place of privilege, once he's a part of a family that has money, that sled that he gets is very lavish and really shows what a different position in life he's come to. And they do that within 2 shots.
And yet he is not satisfied by that. Thatcher goes, "Oh, what do you say?" And I think Kane says, "Thank you, sir," or something similar to that. But it's very cold. It's already as a kid, he's learning that what he had is no longer available to him, and it's a huge formative experience to him. And he loved that sled enough to even attack Thatcher when he first meets him.
So for me, I'm going to give you guys some background to this. I wanted to have a completely fresh perspective. I watched this movie this morning. For everyone listening, I was like, I'm coming in completely fresh, so you're going to get it all from what I see. So I haven't really thought about this too much, but from what I saw, I'm kind of there with you, Tim. Like, what I see is the only time Kane is truly happy is when he's out there in the snow playing, when he's got no idea what's going on, that he's getting ready to get traded away to Thatcher, and he's truly happy out there. He's going for the Union, and he's sledding down the hills on his Rosebud. And so for me, it's just, he's thinking back to a time when he was truly happy before he dies. And for me, it's that Kane dies almost with that youth-like innocence. He's remembering it. And so I think he goes out that way. And so to me, it's more of a happier ending than I think some people let on. Or a happy beginning, because he dies right in the beginning. But yeah, I thought, he's reminiscing and, he's going to a better place. Maybe he can get that back, Well, to me, what Rosebud means, and I'm glad that you guys have that perspective, because my perspective on this is a little bit different, because I think that Rosebud is actually extremely vital to the story. I think it is, as what you say, Tim, that a single word does not make a man's life, but in my opinion, it actually did, because what Rosebud is his childhood. Rosebud is the childhood that was stripped away from him when his mother signed his life over to Thatcher. Rosebud was the time in which he felt like he had love. His father may have been abusive, but his father actually was a loving father. He didn't want him to leave. He didn't want his son to go away. And so Rosebud to him is that love that he never received from anybody, the love that he was never able to actually fulfill because his childhood was so unfulfilled. Rosebud is the love and the childhood that was stripped away from him that then made him into the man that he was, a man that was always seeking for more power to fill that void that he didn't have because he didn't have love in his life. He always looked for people to give him love, for the people's appreciation and the people's affection, but he couldn't actually fill it because he never had love to begin with. It was a black hole that would never be filled. He was forced into a situation where he was never able to be a child. He was forced into a situation where he had to grow up real quick. He had this fortune that was given to him that he had to basically take over and try to do something with. And so, of course, he lived like a playboy, almost a precursor to your Bruce Waynes of today. That was something that was never able to be satisfied. He never had a childhood. I think it's even a more tragic ending because of that fact. And yeah, he may be reminiscing, but to me, it's a reminiscence of this never happened and I wasted my life and I did the wrong things to try and fill that void.
So one other thing that came to my mind is that there are two instances, two other visual instances where I corroborate with you guys on that. So he has a chance to see Rosebud halfway through the movie. We find out that he's on his way to go see all these things that were left from his parents that are just been in storage. And what interrupts him? Meeting Susan. And so that whole thing took away a possibility of him having that childhood back, per se. However, we know that he does get that stuff back. And I guess we know that he didn't get to look through it at all because he remembers this Rosebud, even though he has all of those possessions at Xanadu at the time of his death. We know he didn't look through all of that. Otherwise, he would have seen that Rosebud once again in all of that. And that's simply a shame. Like, he could have had something different if he was able to see that, or depending on how he regards all the rest of it. We don't exactly know. Again, we don't have Kane's full perspective, but I imagine that something would have clicked once he did have that back and saw it.
I hope he found some happiness in death. You know, like I feel like people can just relate so much to his character, even though he's this business tycoon and all that. I just hope he found something, you know. I really loved his character.
To me, this film really is a cautionary tale of what power and what greed and what money and what searching for an unfillable void will do to you. This movie ends with, we see a no trespassing sign, but right before that, smoke. His entire life's work was thrown in the fire to go up in flames. And that's what he did with his life. So this is the part of the show where I want to turn it over to you, Tim. Since you are the co-host, I'm sure you have some thoughts. Maybe we didn't cover something in our discussion. So if there's anything that we left out, maybe you have a couple of thoughts that you had that we didn't hear before. This is kind of your time now as my co-host to bring up some of those things. And if we want to talk about it more, time is yours.
Great. Thank you. I do indeed have a couple notes. So a couple shout outs with this film. Obviously, Orson Welles is the wunderkind that he was, and such a genius, and getting autonomous control over the film, despite any of the studios and such, is impressive. But a couple other shout outs. As a musician that I am, I have to give a shout out to Bernard Herrmann. He's considered one of the greatest film composers of all time, and this was his very first feature. He would eventually be more famous for doing Alfred Hitchcock pictures such as Vertigo and Psycho. So you hear that from Psycho. That's Bernard Herrmann, and of course that whole movie. Anyways, all the music in it is completely original from him, including what they call the ersatz opera. The Salambo was what they called it. They wanted to use an actual opera, but that particular opera, I think, was still under copyright at that point.
Yeah, I was noticing a lot of like Cleopatra references. I think that was really what they were going for. And I totally hear the Alfred Hitchcock inspiration in there later on.
Yeah, it's throughout the entire film, and how he sets the mood just perfectly, and how it would eventually build into his other films too. I just think it's wonderful. And so that's Bernard Herrmann. The other big shout out that I want to do, the cinematographer Greg Toland, which he had been in the business for a good while at this point, and even being nominated for a number of Oscars previously to this. But it's interesting, his Orson Welles even shared the director card with Greg Toland, director of photography, on the same card at the very end of the film, the credits. I don't see that often. You see the director gets his own title card, and that's it. But I just, that's a really neat shout out Orson to do that. But something with Greg Toland, we talked about his deep focus innovations that have been going on, but I also want to talk about the lighting throughout the film. There are so many instances. I immediately think of, once the newsreel ends, you see the projector light that you also see later on when Thompson goes into the vault to read Thatcher's diary. It's the amazing, beautiful beam of light shining down on the table in that vault, top of any other things. But something about the lighting that I noticed in this watching, I actually watched it twice in preparation for this. And so this is my second and third watching, was his use of shadow. So not just light, but his use of darkness. So the reporters, after the newsreel, are always obscured by shadow or by low lighting. And that scene actually has all the male cast of the film in that scene, including Orson Welles and Joseph Cotten and some of the others. All the male cast of that scene are in that scene somewhere. The reporters are always obscured by shadows, except for Thompson at the very end of the film. He is in shadow until after his moment of clarity about his speech about Kane can't be summarized by a single word, how he mentioned that, then he finally walks into the light as he exits the film. I think that's very interesting. It's like it's always something obscures them. They're trying to find the truth on all this, and so they're literally being obscured by the lighting. But the other big instances of shadow is times of moral ambiguity. So I guess his first instance of Kane really being in shadow was as he's writing the Declaration of Principles for the newspaper, which I think is weird because he is the focus in that scene, but he's in shadow and everybody else is not. But I feel that this is like a foreshadow of his descent, his moral descent as things are going along. Which admittedly, I read a little bit about this and this kind of affected my thing, so I can't cite myself on this, but I forget exactly what the website is that I read some of this on. But I agree. Confrontation between Kane and Geddes and his wife and Susan. That scene, the Kane's face is in like a half shadow, which shows that he has a choice to make. And we see what choice he does eventually make shortly after that. But also, one in particular, when after Susan sees the review, and it's the scene where Kane says, "I will not be ridiculed," and it eventually gets to the end of the scene where Kane's shadow is put on Susan. So we know that there she has a choice of what to do, and just after a montage of newspaper stuff, she tries to kill herself. I just think that's brilliant use of shadow.
I wanted to add in there that what's really interesting is this film came out in 1941. Movies like The Wizard of Oz came out a couple years before that. They were just starting to get into Technicolor. There was color film out there, but specifically for that reason, he decided to go with black and white because he wanted to make sure that you had this difference between light and dark, between black and white, to showcase the different themes that were happening just through the lighting itself. And for that reason, in and of itself, he decided to go with black and white instead of color, which was becoming very popular at the time. And also with the lighting of this film, it really changed the way that a lot of films did lighting, especially directly influencing a lot of the film noirs that were done after this point. Film noir wasn't a new thing up to this point, and he was taking kind of some cues from film noir, but it changed the way that film noir really took and used the lighting and the shadow to play with themes. Another bit of camera work that, shout out to Greg Toland also, is that up to this point, a lot of films, you did not see the ceiling. And you saw the ceiling in this film for one of the first times in film history. And the reason that they did that was not only to show the space in which they were, which grounded the story, made the audience know that this was a real thing, not just we're watching a film, but also they did that because they wanted to use really low angles to show the power difference between the characters. And so a lot of the times you see, especially in the beginning of the film, you see a lot of these lower angle shots to show that he is a very powerful person, that he is on his way to success and power. Whereas later on in the film, you see a lot more angles going from above, looking down upon him, looking down on other characters to show that they are more vulnerable, that they have less power.
Yeah, I hadn't even thought about the ceilings bit, but you're absolutely right. They chose another thing as far as mise-en-scene goes. The camera angle is as much of a showing of a power play as the position of everybody on the film. And I just think it's a brilliant use of that medium there. So we talked about briefly mention something about scene transitions. Some of them are kind of weird, like the one with the cockatoo going into Xanadu, just kind of abrupt little jump scare that happens there.
That was very Hitchcocky.
Yeah, very, very much so. Yeah, really cool, but kind of, oh, okay, cool. And one thing that regarding Shadow, so at the end of Leland's flashback, Kane is finishing Leland's bad review for him, and Kane fires him. And so as Leland leaves the office, there's a light at the top corner of the door. It's a four-sided, not quite diamond, not quite trapezoidal kind of shape at the top right-hand side of the film. It's a light that happens over the door there, and then it fades into Kane, the typing at the typewriter, but it's just in that same frame as the lighting right there. And then it transitions back into the present where we see Leland finishing his flashback, but it's in that same frame, but now while we're in the present, it's a shadow. And that shot just kind of lingers for a while until the camera eventually kind of moves down a little bit to see the rest of the shot as the nurses come in and such. And I think that's brilliant.
And the note I wanted to say on just the transition parts, I think that the reason that this film really holds up today, it doesn't feel like a 1941 film. It doesn't feel like a film in a different era. This is a film that a lot of us today, I mean, film has just increased, especially in speed, in transition, in cutting. Everything is so fast and so fast-paced, but so is this film, and it works really well. Like a lot of the films from that time, you watch it today and you're like, man, this is so boring. The pacing is so slow. But not this film. This film, with the transitions, with montages, the speed at which Orson Welles tells the story at such a frantic speed, and it works today just as well as it did back then.
I wholeheartedly agree. And I know this, Evan, you've only seen this movie once, and just today, which that's awesome. Probably will notice a lot of these things again, which I envy your position on this. So seeing for the first time and such, it's wonderful.
Yeah, totally. Like, I'm loving hearing you guys talk about it because I obviously did not pick up everything. I didn't pick up, oh, there's a shadow right there. You know what I'm saying? So I'm loving hearing you guys talk about it because I know the next time I watch it, I'm going to be like looking for every little thing you guys are talking about. And that really heightens your experience as far as I know.
Getting down to the end here, I just want to hear each of your guys' final thoughts. As everybody knows, we don't do a rating system here, but if you can kind of give me your final thoughts, final reviews, what you liked about the movie, if you didn't like it, if you'll watch it again, all that kind of stuff, we'd love to hear what you guys thought about the film.
I just was watching it all the whole time because I knew what I was watching was leading to so many other films that I've watched. Like, this movie inspired everything that we watch today. And I just really appreciate it for that. Sure, yeah. At some points, it can be slow to watch because nowadays we have these action-packed movies with explosions. And can I say his name? Michael Bay. So, for some people, this movie may be hard to watch. Yes. But if you really dig in and if you find something in these characters, then there's something in it for everyone. And even if you don't love cinema as much as the three of us do, you'll find something in it for you. I promise.
So for me, there are a handful of movies. It's always hard for me to come up with like my top favorite movie ever. And I'm still not sure if I would put this as my top favorite movie ever, but there's a value that I hold to movies that after each watch of it, no matter how long that I've watched it, I find something that I miss. And it's like, oh my gosh, why didn't I see that before? Like every time I watch Who Framed Roger Rabbit, for instance, there's always something that I've missed every single freaking time. I rewatched one of my favorite movies ever, Memento, the other day. And even with knowing how the story goes and everything, I picked up on a couple of the things that I've missed. And this movie is no exception. Like, there's a reason why this, as we said before, that this movie holds up and today. And it's 80 years old now, but it's absolutely a masterclass in what films should and could be. And yes, AFI has it as the number one movie of all time, and many people will agree with that. Again, I'm not sure if I agree it as the greatest movie of all time, but there's a reason why it is there, and I wholeheartedly agree with it being up there for them. So yeah, I for anybody listening there, if you have not seen this movie, probably should have, because there's been a big spoiler stuff throughout the whole thing. I recommend seeing it. I recommend getting your friends to see it. It really is a masterpiece in film.
And I just want to say, this film was made in 1941. This film is not new, but it holds up. This film, for years and years and years, has, like you said, been AFI's greatest movie of all time, and it still has not been dethroned. And there's a reason for that. In my opinion, this is the greatest movie ever made. This may not be my favorite movie, but there's a huge distinction there. It may not be my favorite movie, but I believe it is the greatest movie that was ever made, simply because it changed the way that movies were made, number one. Number two, it was a movie that was so different for its time. It was such a film that worked then, it works now. It was revolutionary for the time. The cinema work changed the way that films were made. There are so many things that directors have taken inspiration from. People have copied this movie probably more than any other movie in cinema history, and there's a reason for it. This is one of Steven Spielberg's favorite movies. This is Martin Scorsese's favorite film. This is the favorite film of so many famous directors out there, and there's a reason for that. Like I said, I believe it's the greatest movie of all time. If you don't agree with me, that's fine. You're totally granted to your opinion. I highly suggest it to everybody. The first time I watched it, I was about 3 years into film school. I was the type of person where I was like, this can't be the greatest film ever made. It was made in 1941. I don't want to watch this, but I was forced to watch it in my film appreciation class. And I so appreciated the fact that I was made to watch this film because, like I said, after that moment, it changed me as a filmmaker and the just trajectory in which my filmmaking career would take. So with that, thank you guys so much for coming on this episode. Before we leave, I definitely want to give you guys the chance to share where anybody can find you on social media, where people can find you if they want to follow you. We'd love to keep up with what you guys are doing.
I'm on Instagram. My username is Evan V Mar, all lowercase, Evan V Marr.
Yeah, if you're a casting director, definitely go follow Evan. He's an awesome actor.
I'm also on IMDb and Actors Access and all that. So yeah.
That's too cool. I look forward to seeing your stuff, Evan. I am on Facebook is where I'm most active. I do have an Instagram. I don't remember the name right off. Timothy Messina. Yeah, mostly Facebook for me.
And you guys can always follow me as usual at nick.fleeto.leach. Leach on Instagram, and you can friend me on Facebook, Nick Leach, Leach. And as always, please join the Cinema Club Facebook group at facebook.com/groups/the Cinema Club TCC. We would love to see you guys on there, interact with all the discussion that's happening there, as well as you could be a part of the podcast and choose the movie of the week or be a guest on a podcast in the future. And also listen to us on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, Google Play, Podbean, and anywhere else you get your podcast. So with that, thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you on the next one.